one question that I had thought maybe might be a place to bring together some of the ideas that have come up throughout the day is thinking about how the U.S. military has used all of these different theaters, spaces of throughout the Caribbean, right? Haiti, as seen through Jamaica and observers there, Grenada and Trinidad, as various places to kind of reshape its own identity to itself, right? All of these different kind of projections on the basis of actions in the Caribbean. And I was wondering if you might speak to how you see that changing role throughout the 20th century in each of these different spaces, kind of reflected on a U.S. identity being crafted in conversation with Caribbean military movements.
Oh, I'll start.
Chronological precedence.
Yes. It's a good theme to sort of think through because, one of the things is, and I think it sort of is a subtext running through all our presentations, is how one sort of experience informs another. But of course, it's taking into consideration other things happening in the U.S. sphere as well, which we shouldn't lose sight of. As Shalini mentioned, the Vietnam War preceding Grenada, and then World War II with Trinidad. And so post-Haiti, Haiti gives a sort of way in which that engagement was sort of seen in many respects as sort of a failure. So what do you do after that? How do you re-engage with a Caribbean territory after the experience in Haiti? And these broader conflicts, I think, give a space for those things to be reworked. But I would add, though, that it seems that even when you get back to a re-engagement with that specific territory, and again, looking at the case of Haiti, not all of those previous lessons are learned, because then you do see elements of a similar approach that had been taken before kind of re-emerging, even if the tactics might appear different. The sort of philosophy of how you actually attend to these issues remains very much, a lot of continuity there is how I would explain that. So the issue then of military sort of occupations and how that transforms over time in the Haitian case has a lot to do with sort of these legacies of that first occupation as well, which are very difficult to disentangle, because many of the issues that become issues that lead the United States to intervene either militarily again or in other ways are really to resolve issues created by the legacy of the first occupation.
Are we going chronological?
I guess I can. So I have one answer to that question, but I also want to piggyback on one of the important things I think Matthew was saying, which is about the lessons learned. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think, one of the reasons we might see repeated mistakes is because the lessons we learn from these occupations keep changing, right? In a way, that's what historiography does. So for a long time, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though the Haitian occupation was written about in terms of capacity to transform Haiti, right? And it failed as progressivism, but it was supposed to do X, Y, Z. And then Mary Renda's book, Taking Haiti, that reminds us of another lesson, which is in a way, it points to your question that the U.S. occupies Haiti in part to reimagine itself. I don't think she's really explicit, but a big part of that book is really saying that during the occupation, the United States is redefining itself as an imperial power. Mm-hmm. And so maybe to answer your question then of how Trinidad fits in, I think one way to think about it is the 1940s is also the moment that's redefined as the American century. Mm-hmm. So I think it's your question, I think, points to a new way that historians have begun to think about the occupation, right? Which is not just what it's doing to these societies outside, but what are the consequences for how the United States thinks about itself, right? So it's going abroad to make a kind of domestic point often, or at least what happens abroad is inseparable from how the U.S. thinks about its own image.
I was just thinking that in all of these different situations we've spoken about, one of the questions that always comes into play is what's going to be the balance between diplomacy and force, hegemony and dominance, as you put it, and what is the role of these particular invasions in sustaining a military-industrial complex, right? And in justifying it. The second thing is we've been thinking in terms of Cold War politics, but in relation to Grenada, I was thinking a lot about scale, and when you read accounts of the Grenada invasion, across the board, everybody's struck at, the sledgehammer and the nutmeg, those kinds of metaphors come up. And so one of the things that I feel we sometimes forget in Cold War histories is that, in fact, the confrontation between the Soviets and the US, the two giants, was fought in small theaters, right? And time again. And, Grenada was one of the smallest. Antigua is the place with the bases also. The other thing that strikes me as shifting is, it goes to your earlier question, Martin, about race. And I think you can think about racial interactions between the US military and various Caribbean sites at different times in relation to the US's own history of desegregation of the military. And then the encounters there between, so if you look at Vieques, for example, what happens when there are tensions between white US military troops and Latino Puerto Rican troops, right? And there have been instances of trials that involve that particular dynamic, which is an intra-US military racial dynamic. Yeah, but I don't know if it'll be of interest to others as we talk further. I'm broadly interested just in the ways that citizenship has been militarized in the US. We can talk about that if it's of interest to people.
One of the kind of closing statements in your talk at the beginning of our session was, what are lessons that are learned and unlearned, right? And it does feel like it happens somewhat organically, but at the same time, it's also clear that these lessons get unlearned almost purposefully, right? That they get mapped onto global geopolitical projections and necessities that are driven well beyond the dynamics of that particular Caribbean engagement, right? That are moving through these lessons that are being learned and unlearned.
It's fun. I don't know. Yeah, I think that sometimes it's at least in terms of the Cold War and being able to stroke the fears about communism and between Russia and the United States, the former Soviet Union. I think about it. I think I don't know if it's unlearned, but only in the sense. Perhaps in the sense of it just being, it's a fear-based notion. So you can always strike that. You can always go back and tap into that fear again. It doesn't go away, right? So you can always go back and push that button, again. And it's not that the fear isn't real. Whether fear is real, whether there's something there or not. It's like you do still feel it. You know what I mean? So, and it still acts upon us. And so I think that what I see is this: it is a repetition, but partly because we fall back into places of fear. I think the one that's different, of course, is Guantanamo, right? Because it's Cuba, but it doesn't have the same feeling, to me anyway, as Grenada or these other places. And I think it's partly because it's not an invasion of that land over something. It's just using the land to hold people from a different war.
Well, the Cubans want it back.
No, I know they want it back. I just meant Guantanamo. They want it back. But
So they see it as an occupation.
They do, yes,
Right.
yeah. But I don't know if Americans, our resistance to it is probably from our perspective of whether we should be holding those people there.
Right.
at
The
all.
most recent iteration,
Yeah.
right? So that the Cold War's, as you call it, the Cold War button has now shifted to, that is, the occasions for militarization are now the war on terror and the war on drugs, right? So that's the focus of a lot of the militarization, even in the Caribbean, is I think now the war on drugs, and Plan Colombia and things like that.
But I think in that way, the Haiti example, because it precedes the Cold War, is a really useful one, right? Because the impulse, I think, comes from a really good liberal progressive impulse. So I think in some ways Haiti might be a really instructive example, right? This is the progressive era in US history.
Yeah.
So like Haiti is really progressivism sent abroad. So it's not like, it's not a horrible thing. It's not the Cold War. It's not terrorism. It's like, look, we're going to do good.
Yeah.
So I think in that way Haiti is like,
Could I just add and slightly complicate the issue a little bit? I think it's important we put on the table Caribbean people's responses to U.S. military interventions over time, because as we talk about issues of learning, unlearning, there's also that, right? I mean, coming back to Harvey's point about dominance, that as much as there may be a rejection in certain areas of U.S. cultural imperialism and the sort of color of military occupation, if you will, how it's done and so on, there's also still this grappling with the fact that the United States is a dominant northern neighbor. And there are all sorts of issues and ramifications of that, some of which I mentioned very early on in the early 20th century there in the U.S. occupation of Haiti. But then you see it again in the Grenada case, where there is a celebration of when the United States came in and other things. And that's still something that people have to grapple with, right? I mean, how do you negotiate a space in which you accept this dominant power is going to be part of your life and your country's life, and particularly in periods of crisis, and at the same time be aware of what comes with that, you know, the implications of all of that. And I think that's still an issue that in the different islands people are still having to deal with, even in places that have not been occupied by the U.S.
Yeah, that was kind of my question, an obvious way of kind of turning around Janine's opening question was, you know, the extent to which the Caribbean as we know it has been constructed in relation to the US, right, through these kind of occupations and various other kind of influences. You know, I mean, what you're saying is it's clearly complicated, right, and, you know, it's not, you know, there's the cultural imperialism and other kind of forms of influence and so on that people, you know, certain people accept to some degree, or that, you know, they're not seen as, or they seem to infiltrate a culture, if you like. But yeah, the question was basically the extent to which the Caribbean, as we know, if we hadn't had these interventions, or if they had been carried out in different ways, would we think of the Caribbean differently, or would Caribbean think of itself differently?
yeah, it's like one of the cool like counterfactual questions, right? And it's a good way to think about what makes it significant, right? To think, what if it didn't happen? So at least one way I try to think about it is that the U.S. just represents another in a long line of colonial, or let's say foreign powers, right? So, and maybe in that way, even for me, why the distinction between the U.S. and Europe becomes important. Only because I'm thinking, what does it mean to have another kind of dominant presence? But Caribbean history has been like created in the context of colonial power, right? So from jump. So in some ways, to me, I think what's interesting about that, Caribbean people from jump have understood their sovereignty as compromised. In some ways, it becomes a struggle, but it's never something they have really had a sense that could be practically useful. So even when they become independent from European powers, the US is there. So I guess one way to answer that question in a short way, I think the US presented another face of a dominant outsider. And in some ways, I think for me, because it's a new world outsider, it holds some promise. Some of the very promise of the US, I think, is in its familiarity. That there's a way Caribbean people can find ways to identify with the US. And maybe that's one reason I push the particular argument, so that people in the US might identify with the Caribbean in a certain way and make that relationship potentially more productive than just purely imperial, right? If they had a sense of historical solidarity with the Caribbean, would the US then craft its policies differently. I mean, that's the hopeful side of me.
Do you have something to say?
No, I'll let you go.
All right. When in Shalini's presentation, she talked about the end of the Grenadian Revolution as the kind of the end of a certain form of politics. You know, the kind of that kind of socialist, left-wing kind of ideal, I guess. But I was wondering you know, if you can relate that to the kind of ideas that and I mean it's clearly related to David Scott's latest book, you know, and the idea that we're living in a period where that romantic anti-colonialism no longer seems viable, right? So I think what you were suggesting, Shalini, was that the Grenadian Revolution marks the kind of end of that, right? But I was wondering what about the cumulative effect of the various US occupations and interventions and so on had on that kind of discourse, that kind of romantic and anti-colonial ideal.
Sure, and I guess I want to say that when I make claims like that, they're usually pretty circumscribed, so I wouldn't say that it marked the end forever of, progressive movements in the region, and I think that the 80s and 90s were a period of retreat. But I think a lot of our conversation would also shift if we thought more about the Spanish Caribbean and the relationship of the Caribbean to Latin America when we're making these claims. So, for example, through much of the 90s and the early 2000s, much of Latin America was governed by democratically elected left governments, right? What they call the pink tide. So I guess what I'm saying is I think that there was a newly, that the late 90s see the reinvention of a mass left politics that is, that David actually doesn't talk about, right? So I guess I question two things. One is, should tragedy be the only mode, the only genre that we use as an alternative to romance in relation, the only in which to think about the failure of some of these revolutions or invasion, or are there other genres that we can use besides romance and besides tragedy? And I think in relation to Grenada, there's this great book that came out fairly recently, and there's been a lot of writing after Hurricane Ivan. It seems like it kind of opened up some ways of thinking, rethinking that period. But there's this lovely account of the revolution that's neither romance nor tragedy, and it has this kind of very, just like a very quotidian way of thinking about the revolution, and it describes, so there's March 13th comes along, and this guy who's been training for it and, is really part of the underground liberation army, he sleeps through it, So those kinds of things that just bring the whole narrative into the everyday. It's a much more intimate story, and I think that can do a lot of work that's really useful.
I think one of the interesting things that struck me was that in all the presentations and I guess less so in Valerie's film, that virtually all the main players were men, right?
That's right.
So, I'm wondering about the gender issues that come up in various revolutions, because and it seemed actually, against that those mass crowds that those photographs, it seemed like there's a fairly good mix of men and women. So, I'm wondering about those. Well, specifically about the Grenadian case, it seemed very much a kind of male-led movement. Would that be right, or to what extent was that maybe a weakness of the movement?
I think you're right that the public faces, or the people who had the majority of the positions were men. But I mean, I heard a lot about the women. I mean, I think that Bernard Cord's wife was pretty active. I don't know if she had an official title in the group, but
She did.
she did, yeah. And she was pretty active, like with him. And then the woman she was like the minister of education. She was also killed there. So I think that in some ways the women in the movement were kind of, maybe more elevated compared to traditional, what was going on there. But, but I still think it seems still to be, at least the men were doing most of the talking and at least had the sort of, but I do feel like the women, I feel like when the people I interviewed, that their mothers and were, very active and were also part of, we're drawing them into the, into understanding the revolution. So I do feel like women were really active in it, and I think that they sort of, my understanding was that they sort of celebrated the opportunities for women as well.
So my sense is that a lot of the most common way that you hear about the participation of women is in terms of their incorporation into militias. I think that boast is a largely masculine narrative, though. And so I think if you think about the story of the revolution as the story of the party, then you get a mainly masculine account. If you think about the revolution as about the people, then you get a much more gender-sensitive account. And I agree with you about, it's a very interesting thing. The story of the conflict between Maurice Bishop and Bernard Cord has so overdetermined the understanding of the revolution that I think really important parts of it, like Jackie Kreft, Minister of Education, that was one of the most egalitarian and radical and mass mobilizing parts of the revolution. And I think partly because of her relationship with Maurice Bishop, it's the romance story that gets told. And her, kind of quite radical, democratic, political, activist history is very rarely told. So I think there's some historiographical work that needs to be done. Actually, there's one other thing that I might add about the gender things, which is that, Phyllis Cord was head of the National Organization of Women, and which was more or less the women's wing of the party. And I think one of the things that happened after the revolution was to say that, we really need to have a women's movement that is not like a mass women's movement that is autonomous of particular political parties. So it's not the women's wing of the party, and that's got to be a shift in the way that feminists organize.
Just to make sure that the women alone don't answer the gender question, which would be its perverse gender way. Obviously the stuff that I do, women play like key roles, but what I was consciously trying to do in the narrative was to make sure it was clear that the way women engage, the opportunities presented by American men would challenge the established gender system in Trinidad. But it put me in an intriguing place, because then I was making American men have this kind of emancipatory impact. So I was very aware, maybe in some ways, like when you do a documentary, that I'm still controlling the narrative. So, so I was conscious of what that could have done. But
Well, actually, I had a question for you, Matthew, which is like, so I have a sense of Harvey's answer to this from Trinidad, but during the U.S. occupation of Haiti, what was the impact on wages?
On wages?
For Haitians.
Well, the broad spectrum of it I'm not as aware of. I do know that there was, of course, a lot of forced labor that was done for the building of railroad networks and so on. The corvée system was resuscitated and used, and that was part of the reason for so much peasant resistance at the time. In terms of if there was an improvement of wages among urban workers, I'm not certain to what extent that was actually done.
Because that was a really interesting point that you made in your book, right? That essentially it was the local Trinidad elite that was trying to hold wages down when the U.S. was raising wages in all the associated construction, base work, etc.
In thinking of colonial, and you mentioned this, the long history of colonialism of the Caribbean, beginning with the European powers. I mean, before America was even around, but or at least as we know it. Yes, I think that it was different in the sense that people, the plantations and things that they started, a lot of times with the second, third sons who didn't have land or whatever, and would come here and run these plantations. I mean, whether they lived here or absentee, whatever, it fed right back into Europe, and they established governments, and it was just like you say, like, this is it, we're taking it over. Whether they lived here or not, it was, the extraction of stuff, but still the government that was here mirrored the government that was in England or whatever, with, or in France or whatever. And I think that here, you're right. I mean, it's like when we go in, other than, I suppose, Puerto Rico, or, but other than, it's not so much that we're all going to stay, you know what I mean? And that we're planning to live here and or at least not overtly, putting, Americans in power and taking the land. It's not overt anyway. I mean, maybe behind the scenes, but it is different.
Or
than
maybe
the
it's
European
overt
philosophy.
but not formal,
Right.
right? I mean,
Just-
so it's empire but not colonialism,
Right.
something like that.
Or maybe thinking about the example of Guantanamo, right? We were talking about how in some ways it doesn't even feel like an invasion because it's just a separation from the Cuban cultural sphere, right? It isn't attempting to interact with Cuba culturally. It's just, we're going to build,
Use this land.
take this, wall this off, and now this is a base that we use. But there isn't an attempt. In fact, there's an attempt to not interact too much with local populations, or
Not at all.
right.
I mean, I think, and that's what you're stating is another version of one of the things I've been trying to argue in a way, right? That I think what this might be linked to is the U.S. doesn't have a civilizing mission. And I think in your line, when you talk about someone saying the U.S. are a hustling race, and like today, it's even a critique we hear today. So you would go into Iraq and people would say nation building, you don't do it, but it's like you pull out, right? And I want to link that to a post-colonial insecurity, or what I'll call at least the absence of a European confidence in a mission to civilize people. But there's also, again, on the flip, a positive version to that story. And part of that story is that the American populace has always been doubtful of it. So it's not just like the leaders are saying, well, we're insecure, we can't do it. They can't really generate support. And Puerto Rico is a really intriguing example, right? So they couldn't claim Puerto Rico as a colony, in part because Americans, somewhat out of racism, don't want Puerto Rico to be like part of the U.S. because they fear that we'll be giving citizenship to brown people. So it's really interesting, the reasoning, but I think that to me it's an important story because it means that a European audience can buy Napoleon III, right, when he's saying, yes, we're going to civilize these places. And they're like, yeah, let's go. And the American audience are like, well, no. And then the reasoning for no is like, but so does that mean they become citizens like us? Then definitely no.
I guess that's one way to interpret it too. But when you think about I agree with you to some degree, but I also think that the history of the United States, not for everybody, but I mean that the idea that some people were fleeing persecution. I mean, obviously slaves came completely differently against their will, but but for a lot of Europeans, they are obviously fleeing starvation or persecution, religious, otherwise, and so all these different people come together, and I think there is a sort of somewhat discomfort also with the idea of saying, all my way, you know what I mean? I know it did happen with a manifest destiny to some degree, but that was like a land grab and just, money. But the idea of, I think that some people, not everybody in America, but some people are uncomfortable with the idea of dominating another culture. So in the sense of like yours is bad, ours is good. At least to the extent that they couldn't get enough support in the United States, they could get half maybe the country to support it, but not all of us necessarily to support it.
No, go ahead.
I'll just add one thought to that. It's a narrative that's being written as a wider history is unfolding. And if we go back to the last quarter of the 19th century, is when you begin to see some of this developing. think about what European countries were doing in Africa then, and think about the buildup of naval power in the United States and the way in which bases in nearby hemispheric regions become very crucial to sort of developing this much more powerful navy. And so the narrative of how the United States begins to see itself in relation to other countries in the hemisphere is sort of mounted on these questions of race on one hand, so as a sort of basic view that these other countries can benefit from the sort of knowledge or sort of quote unquote civilization that we're bringing, but also very important pragmatic things that U.S. policymakers believe that they need, things like bases, so on. The first real sort of attempt to gain a foothold in Haiti actually happens in the 19th century with the whole debate over Mont Saint Nicolas, a northern part of Haiti, which the United States wanted to develop as a coaling station. And a very famous naval captain named Girardi said, quite almost belligerently, we must have this, that Britain has coaling stations in the Caribbean. Germany had a big coaling station in St. Thomas, which also became a U.S. protectorate in 1917. That there's this whole idea that these things become crucial as our might and power is extending. But the narrative of how we are going to engage with the countries that we are now having to take more control of is being written as it goes along. Perhaps that speaks to what Harvey calls a sort of insecurity of where the United States was at the time. But I think so many things are happening. Industrialization was happening. I mean, so many things that were sort of pushing the U.S. in that direction. Then, of course, Cuba and Spain become so crucial to that.
I was thinking about the civilizing mission. I see why you say that, and there are many ways in which it's true that that the U.S. didn't have a civilizing mission in the way that France or Britain did. But I think where it comes close is in the discourse around freedom, where free trade and freedom and democracy become conflated. So the civilizing mission is democracy understood as free trade. And that is seen as an advance, right? I mean, there is that linear sense of progress towards free trade.
Yeah.
So that's where I would see it operating.
Yeah. And I would, again, most of my arguments I would make, they would end around World War II.
Right.
Right. So I think modernization after World War II is a more confident U.S. that's saying, not only we modernize the world, but we are the model of modernity. So in a way, even if they don't get civilization, they own modernity.
That's a good way of
Right.
that is
So
a
that's
really good
how
way
I'm
of putting
accounting
it.
in a way
Yeah.
for after World War II. My argument loses. I think the U.S. at that point is modernization theory is basically the U.S.'s version of a civilizing mission.
And maybe if not a civilizing mission, then a kind of proselytizing around free trade dogma. And also, if we think about evangelical missions in Africa and Latin America now, a very particular kind of intent to make inroads in how people construct their socialization elsewhere. Yeah. I'd been thinking about a question for the three of you in terms of the one thing that struck me that I hadn't really thought of as we were conceiving of this, but the role of the media as it shifts in each of these different engagements, right? So the observers in Jamaica writing about this, but with a kind of big time delay of, 2 years before different testimonies start circulating more widely. Maybe the role of popular performance as being a space for, if not contestatory narratives, and certainly thinking about that influence in the social transformations in Trinidad. And then, of course, that amazing comic that you had up where like the TV is the one weapon of destruction that has to be shaped and retold for the purposes of these different occupations to be propagated. And I was wondering if you might speak to that changing role, both on the side of how the U.S. is disseminating information about what it wants to do, and also kind of competing viewpoints as they circulate throughout the Caribbean region, and how that shapes responses to each of these moments.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I think that you do see that issue, particularly in the Haitian case, of media representations of the occupation and also of Haitians generally, really sort of expanding significantly by the time you get to the 1920s into the 1930s. And much of it is done in a way to sort of justify the need for the U.S. presence. And particularly at a time when there were all of these sorts of questions about, because you have that sort of counter-media narrative, a counter-narrative that exists in the media as well, right? The stories about what was truly happening, the real story of what's happening in Haiti. Crisis, another journal, African-American journal that ran some articles on this. And so in a sense, this notion of Haiti as retrograde and therefore in need of what a democratic power like the United States is bringing to Haiti, sort of it reifies the occupation and the presence of the United States there. But by the time you get to the 1930s, what's really interesting, and Mary Render's book Taking Haiti explores this in the second part of the book, is the fascination with Haiti in U.S. media. You see that across the board, from plays to artistic representations to film, the various tropes about Haiti that sort of come in during that decade of the 1930s, and we could catalog several examples from Orson Welles' play to other things, some of the painting. But I would add here though that, and I think you mentioned this point, Janine, is how does that sort of bounce back to the Caribbean? Because I find also in the Caribbean in the 1930s, you have a similar sort of engagement with Haiti through media, right? And through media representations of Haiti. And in some senses really tries to sort of pull Haiti back and say, look, this is ours too, right? This isn't just yours, and the independence of Haiti becomes important as a sort of fuel for the nationalist agenda as nationalism in the British Caribbean begins to develop. And so you begin to see there as well things such as plays and stories and so on about Haiti that don't necessarily revalorize Haiti and Haitians completely, but at the same time it does say that the United States has not done a good job in Haiti, and so you get that a lot in that narrative. And so then comes that question of which I find very interesting, which I'm exploring in some work that I'm doing now. How does the whole concept of Caribbean and West Indian be redefined at that moment of the 1930s? And I think literature and some of the media representations of that period tell us a lot about that. Because I mean, up to that period, the whole idea of West Indian did include Haiti. When Jamaicans talked about the West Indies and West Indians, they thought of Haiti. And then somewhere along the way, with the occupation, with these other shifts, that somehow Haiti sort of pulled apart and presented separately, which I find interesting.
Well, I mean, that's something just that your book shows really, really clearly. We tend to think about Haiti as being super isolated now, but that in fact it has been wended and woven into a pan-Caribbean sensibility from way back when. So.
I was just thinking in relation to this that, of course, in Grenada, the press wasn't allowed in for the first few days. So by the time they showed up, most of the military action was over. That is, all the authorized external journalists. And so the stories broadly fell into two kinds. One was a critique of military press censorship, which they made then, which by the time of Iraq has more or less disappeared, right? You don't see the same level of indignation within the US media that you saw in Grenada. And the second is that much of the war writing and coverage by the US media was in the genre of the human interest story and really employed a lot of the Caribbean picturesque tropes, and so kind of made it seem like there was a happily ever after resolution So that struck me. But what I'm always interested in the local media accounts, and one of the things I find really quite heartening is one is, of course, the Calypso archive, the Calypso narratives. And so, like, when you talk about Trinidad, it's like you'll go and you'll talk to an expert, and they're like, yeah, you know, that whole rum and Coca-Cola period. And, there's something really useful and interesting. I mean, whatever the rum and Coca-Cola account might leave out, nonetheless, to have it called that, right? That is, to have Calypso as the central lens through which you shorthand an account of history was quite interesting. Same in Grenada, that 1951 period being called Sky Red, to reflect like the Creole name for that period in which the plantations were set ablaze under Gary. I mean, I think there's something that comes through. There's a form of memory there that's really important.
So I wanted to hear more about if you had ideas about that shift, how Haiti becomes like pulled out from. So I want to say that, but and then I want to save time. I want to be quick on the media question. I think film, like I feel like to think about U.S. occupations and maybe just to think about like the media and U.S. imperialism in the 20th century is like
Movies.
Yeah, it's like movies, right? And
I would agree
partly
with
my
that.
head went to this crazy, and tell me if it's an just coincidence, but Birth of a Nation is like 1915, right? So it's the same year. So it's like Birth of a Nation, but Birth of the U.S., right? I mean, in my case in Trinidad, film is so important that maybe one of my most crucial discussions about the Saga boys, the Zoot Suiters, that could have happened without the occupation. Because everyone went to see stormy weather and a zoot suit was worn there, right? So there's a way that the film could have done some of that work,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's
they
true.
didn't have to be there.
I think it's movies and
right,
television
it's movies.
and
then
television reaching. I mean, whenever that happened, when was that? But it used to be that there's very few shows that came through, and then suddenly there was like an explosion, and everybody has cable, and everybody can see anything at any time. And that I can feel the difference when you go.
Yeah, a lot of the early steel bands, right, Harvey, were named after, films.
Right, Casablanca, and yeah. Invaders, yeah.
And a lot of Western.
Yeah. And then one other thing with the connection with Grenada, then, because I think it's a story that's missed, but like Island in the Sun is like
Yeah, you're talking
a
about
huge
that.
film in the 50s. And the interesting thing is the conflation, that people in the Caribbean assume that Island in the Sun is about Eric Gary. Because they have read a novel. So talk about medias, right? There's there's Alec War writing what he thinks is like the big decolonization novel and centering this Gary-like character. But he's also writing it and thinking, oh, Hollywood will buy this.
Yeah.
Right.
He's conscious it's like the era of the epics in the US in the 50s, and he's writing something to be made for film. And then when it's shown in the Caribbean, people think it's their life on screen, so they all flock to it. Yeah, I mean, and then it's crazy because Gary then does something out of that movie. Like there's a scene in the movie where the Belafonte character uses steel band to like disrupt elections. Gary does the same thing in real life, and he goes to jail for it. It's like reality and illusion. Right, but yes.
I'll add, and I won't be long, so you'll have a chance to come in shortly with the question. But I'll answer the question that Harvey posed to me by actually entering it through that point on film, which I think is really, really important because film becomes a space, a medium in which all of these different views of not just Haiti but the Caribbean can be presented. And it comes also back to, I think, Martin's first question, or second question, if there was no military occupation, what would that relationship be? Would you have still had it? And perhaps film gives us a sense of that because people are still gravitating towards film. A film I enjoy showing my students when I teach Haiti in Jamaica is a film called The Devil's Daughter, which came out in the mid-1930s, and it was sort of advertised as a film that features an all-black cast, and it's set in Haiti, and it climaxes with this great voodoo blood dance scene. And then when that scene comes in the film, and I show my students, it has nothing to do with voodoo. It's a Jamaican revivalist ceremony, and the whole film was actually shot in Jamaica. But then you get that whole sort of conflation of the sort of tropical trope and so on in that. But then it does convey this sort of picture of Haiti, of the Caribbean in a certain way that is very, very powerful. And of course, some of this stuff is rejected, but then there's stuff that's accepted within the Caribbean as well, right, in terms of how people see each other through the medium of American films.
Yeah.
And the last point I'll make connected to that too is, I mean, just looking at World War II as a pivotal moment in these relationships, and we think of it again in terms of broad imperialistic thrusts. But then there's another thing that comes out of it for the Caribbean, with the U.S. relationship with the Caribbean, is the expansion of the tourist market. You really begin to see more and more North American tourists coming into the Caribbean with the advent of commercial flights to the islands. And then that also has an impact not only on American imagining of the Caribbean, but also coming back to a point Harvey made in his presentation, that during occupations they create opportunities as well. So people see that you have a foreign presence coming into your country and there's opportunity there. And so that's when you begin to see things such as, mock voodoo ceremonies in Haiti as a way to sell that to tourists, and similar versions of that in other islands.
When you were talking about film, or you guys were talking about film, I think it's true that is like this huge force in the world. Do you know what I mean? Where you see, and what I find when I go to Trinidad or these other places, that there's a huge desire to sort of make movies are cheaper now. Everybody can use digital. You can make it with your iPhone. So obviously a lot of people can go after making films, and I see that it's getting to a place where people want to make films that are more reflective of their own culture and not necessarily mirroring the pattern of American films, you know what I mean, which, we have a pattern in our movies that I think work well. I mean, I work in that industry, but I appreciate that there are other ways of approaching, and I can see people wrestling with that, really struggling to come up with their own film language, do you know what I mean, that would, capture not just on a superficial level like what's happening in Trinidad or whatever, but culturally different, and that's why I think that movie Timbuktu resonates, in case anybody saw that one, is because it really does come through the filter of a different culture and lens. I mean, it's this common film language, it's a visual storytelling, which is what film's all about. But the manner in which you tell it, I can see that there's a lot of struggle with trying to move away from the gravitational pull of how a lot of movies are told.
The host culture also always knows the difference between what is a false image and what's the real image in a country. I don't know if anyone else wants to deal with.
Well, the one thing I'll say, I think making the image becomes part of the culture. Another way of saying it, right? So if growing locks might be the thing to do if you're like a rent-a-dread on the beach, and that's how you get foreign girls, then like growing the locks is it's the making of the image for the foreigner, but that's part of the culture, right? Most times the foreigner might miss the making as the culture and see the image as the culture.
I would agree with that. I think it becomes sort of reflective, and it becomes part. I mean, you may know the difference, but you're still impacted by it. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of you're still going to evolve and change and ingest some of it, even if you are making it. To me, I agree with you.
Martin, can I just say one little tiny thing in response to your question about the impact on Caribbean people and how Caribbean people respond to this? How would things have been different? And it seems to me one of the things that all of these military occupations that we've talked about and several others have done is to, in various ways, release waves of intra-Caribbean migration and therefore forms of contact between Caribbean people that would not otherwise have taken place or would have taken other forms. So that seems like a big
So you're seeing
factor.
that as a more or less direct result of the occupations or
so whether it's like the militarization of Panama and imported labor there, or Guantanamo and you have imported West Indian labor in addition to the Cubans, or in Trinidad you've got people coming in from Barbados. So there are kind of intra-Caribbean contacts, dialogues, antagonisms that get put into motion as a result of a lot of these military occupations.
And to that question too, I kept thinking of like the missing, the absence presence, right? The Dominican Republic. And so I wonder what a student of the Dominican Republic might say to that question, because I think in a way they won't be able to escape the emergence of Trujillo. So in some ways of that counterfactual, right, the way it was posed, if no occupation, is there Trujillo? And if no Trujillo, the Dominican Republic looks...
Or is there a Duvalier?
Right. I was wondering if it has the same connection in Haiti with Duvalier, but I guess with the Guard, perhaps?
Yeah, and other types of contact. I mean, one of the things that helps Duvalier in his medical career is when he joins the medical mission, and that becomes very important for him in raising his status. So you have that as well.
I really want to thank our speakers, because they've really created something here which I think is exactly what we were trying to achieve, that kind of dialogue between the various occupations and giving that broader scope of US influence across the Caribbean in the 20th century. So please join me in thanking our speakers, and thanks everyone for coming out. Thank you.